Breaking news this morning as the U.S. and China have come to terms on a trade agreement. The U.S. has agreed to slash its tariffs on China from 145% down to 30%, while China has agreed to reduce its tariffs on American goods from 125 to 10%. So this will be in effect for 90 days. The U.S. stock market is up dramatically on the news. The S&P is up 2.5%. The Nasdaq is up more than 3.5%. Gold is down 3%. The U.S. dollar is up 1%, and the 10-year yield is also up 1%. What's going to happen next to both economies? Will this trade agreement last beyond 90 days? We'll find out with our next guest, Shaun Rein, who is the founder and managing director of the China Market Research Group, an expert on China's economy. We've had Shaun on several times before on the show. Check out our last interview with Shaun, link down below. Good to have you back, Shaun. Welcome back.
Great to be here, David. It's a happy day for people in China. You can see the smile on my face because it's very clear to the Chinese that they beat Trump, at least in this first battle of the trade war. Xi Jinping and the CPC didn't blink. They didn't fold. They didn't kneel down. Let me be very clear. They didn't make any concessions whatsoever to Trump, but Trump and Scotty Bessent had to roll back the tariffs from 145% down to 10%. The same amount that they have on the rest of the world, and then in addition to the 20% for fentanyl, for a total of 30%. So it's very clear to the Chinese that they're getting rid of the stench of a century of humiliation at the hands of Western imperial powers for trying to keep China down. So for Chinese, there's a feeling that ASEAN, that the global South, or I prefer to call the global majority, or Europe, is going to realize that China has become the major global superpower because they didn't blink. Now, Trump, he not only did he fold, not only did he blink, but he actually prostrated himself in front of the Chinese by getting rid of these tariffs for 90 days, because it's very clear, David, he couldn't withstand the domestic American pressure. You have the companies like Amazon and Walmart who are complaining about high tariffs or empty store shelves. You had companies like Apple saying that they wouldn't be able to sell iPhones unless they had an exemption. Farmers were demanding that they got subsidies. And that's not even talking about small, medium enterprises that have already started laying off workers because they didn't know what the next 3 months were going to be like for them. So Trump and Scotty Bessent put America into a really bad position. It's good for the world that they've come to an agreement for 90 days. The equity markets are going up, skyrocketing all over the world. But for me, David, as an American, I'm really sad because America got humiliated. We lost prestige. We lost standing. Nobody's going to trust any threats. Nobody's going to trust any pressure from America, or at least under Trump, because they know he's a paper tiger.
Before we continue with the video, I want to talk quickly about today's sponsor, investing.com. You all know investing.com, but I want to tell you about Investing Pro, the company's flagship subscription tool that helps retail investors find stocks others can't. It's packed with features that make research faster and smarter. Now, I've been using it to track my watch list, get a clearer picture of stock health, and spot opportunities that I may have already overlooked. One standout tool is the fair value calculator. It gives you a quick indication of whether a stock is undervalued or overpriced, like a traffic light for your portfolio. I also like Pro Picks feature, which is a stock picker that has consistently beaten the S&P 500. Super Microcomputer Inc., for example, returned 176% since being flagged by Pro Picks. Investing Pro has a ton of other incredible features to help you find stocks that others can't. I managed to get a special discount for you. Click on the link in the description down below or scan the QR code here to get 15% off your first Investing Pro subscription at checkout. Yeah, the internet's been divided. The American side obviously thinks that the American side has won, and the Chinese side believes that, like you said, the century of humiliation is now gone. I wonder what actually happened behind the curtains. Do we know what deals or terms have been met or negotiated, at least preliminarily?
I don't have any inside knowledge, but nothing has happened. There's no concession. So yeah, the Chinese dropped down to 10% on the tariffs, which is actually good for China because they're going to be able to buy products cheaper. Again, tariffs don't make any sense. The tariffs are a tax on American consumers. They're a tax on Chinese consumers and companies. But there's no agreement where China has to buy more soybeans. So if you look at it, in the last couple months, China has stopped buying American beef. They're now buying beef from Australia. China stopped buying American oil. They're buying oil from Canada. China stopped buying soybeans from America. They're now buying soybeans from Brazil. So basically, everything that America sells, except for ethane and semiconductors, the Chinese are able to buy elsewhere. So it's very clear right now that America needs a supply chain from China more than China needs America. Now, let's be clear. The trade war hurts China too. There's about 15 million Chinese who work in jobs that deal with exports to the United States. About 14% of overall exports from China go to America. And you're seeing a lot of smaller factories making 50 to 100,000 US in revenue in southern China around Panyu are closing. So the trade war did hurt China too. But it's clear that China could push back and Trump had to prostrate himself because of the domestic pressures. Now, I don't have any inside knowledge. Something interesting, though, David, is that I actually used to advise Scotty Bessent on his China investing strategy when he was still at Soros.
Oh, wow.
And I was looking at my notes. The problem with Scotty was that he never looked at China from a pragmatic, data-driven standpoint. He always said that China was going to collapse or the economy was going to weaken because it's a communist country. He was viewing China from an ideological standpoint, which is why I think he has misled Trump over the last several months by arguing that China was going to fold, that China, because it sells more to the United States than it buys, needs America. So I think we're getting really bad advice from Scotty Bessent, Howard Lutnick towards Trump. Frankly, I think Trump's going to take it out on them because he's realized he's been embarrassed and he's going to fire Scotty and maybe Howard by Christmas time.
Really? So you don't think this was Trump's initiative? This was from the advisors that work with him?
I think this is clearly Trump's initiative. I mean, he's in charge of everything right now, but I think he's being fed really bad advice from the yes men or sycophants around him who are too scared to push back against him. But I think the reality is with Trump, anybody who gets too close to him, he uses them as a scapegoat. If something goes wrong, he points at them, right? He went after Mike Pence with January 6th. Rudy Giuliani has had his entire reputation destroyed and he's been discarded like an old doll on the side of the road. I think Scotty Bessent, he's forever had his reputation besmirched because he's the one who front and center repeatedly over the last 5 weeks has said, China doesn't have the cards. China's going to have to bend down. And he's been using, historical analysis in his mind, saying that historically, whichever country sells more is the one in a weaker position. I think he sold not just to the American people, but he sold to Trump that Trump was right. And he was not giving Trump the right information. So, yeah, I blame Scotty Bessent as an ideologue for not directing Trump in the right way. But obviously, Trump at the end of the day is the number one decision maker, but he's going to blame someone else when things go wrong.
All right. Besson was on CNBC this morning. This is what he had to say. We do not want a generalized decoupling from China. What we do want is a decoupling from strategic necessities, which we were unable to obtain during COVID. And we realized that efficient supply chains were not resilient supply chains. He says we're going to create our own steel. Tariffs protect our steel industry. They work on critical medicine, semiconductors, so on. We are doing that, and the reciprocal tariffs have nothing to do with the specific industry tariffs. It sounds like it's not just China he wants to decouple from. He wants independence in terms of manufacturing.
Yeah, I think, look, frankly, on this point, I understand there's some legitimate reason from a national security standpoint to say that the United States shouldn't outsource everything, essentially. Like, I generally am a free trader. I believe in comparative advantage. The Americans should make what they're good at: Hollywood, financial services, semiconductors. China, Japan, other countries, the French should make what they're good at. But at the end of the day, from a national security standpoint, it does make sense to provide incentives to get some of these industries moving back to the United States. Like, for instance, antibiotics. It doesn't make sense that 70 to 80% of all the inputs into antibiotics are made in China. This is something that puts America at a national security risk. It doesn't make sense that China is, refining 80% of rare earth and about 95% of high-end rare earth, because that's a choke point that the Chinese have a stranglehold over the United States. So it does make sense, and I do agree with Scotty Besson on this, that the United States needs to have some industries to protect itself come back to the United States. Now, by doing that, they should have incentives.
Yeah.
They should try to have, get rid of red tape, regulatory red tape issues to try to make the United States more competitive to attract more investment. You shouldn't be putting tariffs. You shouldn't be putting export controls. You shouldn't be putting sanctions. And you certainly shouldn't be demonizing other countries. Over the last, 7-8 years, DC has gone full-blown xenophobia, talking about the CPC as the evil red commies, that they're trying to take over the world. You see David Perdue, who has just agreed to be the next U.S. ambassador to Beijing, has written a op-ed saying that the United States is under an existential threat from China, and that China wants to implement its value system and its political system onto the United States. Now, this is obviously ridiculous. China is not looking to invade and control the United States, but this xenophobia that both the Trump and Biden regimes have put together has really conditioned the American population to hate China when they really shouldn't. There's a legitimate issue on national security, an illegitimate issue on demonizing China, to the point that Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, said today that he's willing to ban all mainland Chinese from buying homes in Texas. That just doesn't make any sense. Like, if these mainland Chinese are spies, sure, ban them. But if they just happen to be born in China, that doesn't mean they're necessarily a risk just because of their nationality.
So going back to your earlier point about Chinese trade and whether or not the Chinese even need the U.S. So from my understanding, Chinese exports grew by 8.1% in April, despite substantial U.S. tariffs of 145% up until today. So two-part question. Why did this happen? In other words, who are the trading partners that China cooperated with that resulted in an 8.1% increase in exports? And second part of the question, does China even need a deal with the U.S. if that's the case?
So look, this is the most bullish I've been in China's economy in the last 6 years. So for the last 5-6 years, I've been extremely bearish, been one of the biggest bears on Wall Street, looking at China. But you've seen in the last month or two, there's a lot of animal spirits are growing back. Things are getting done. You saw in the Qingming holiday festivals that 8% increase on tourism spending, and exactly what you said, an 8.1 increase in exports. How does this happen? First of all, in 2017, America accounted for about 18% of China's exports. That is now down to about 14%. ASEAN now accounts for 16% of China's exports. So a couple of weeks ago, when President Xi went to Vietnam, he was met at the airport by the president of Taiwan. When he went to Malaysia, he was met at the airport by the prime minister of Malaysia. When he went to Cambodia, he was met by the king of Cambodia. So what's happened, David, is regions or countries like ASEAN are increasing their trade with China. African trade went up about 25% in the last couple of months. The president of Kenya just met with President Xi in Beijing on a national summit. The president of Brazil, Lula, is in Beijing this week for a meeting with Xi Jinping. You also see the foreign ministers of Latin America and CARICOM, or the Caribbean, are meeting this week tomorrow with Xi Jinping. So the global south, or the global majority, is starting to pick up the slack on exports. They are the region that Chinese want to be able to go out and invest in. If you go now, for instance, to Singapore, BYD, a Chinese NEV automaker, has replaced Toyota and BMW as the biggest seller of autos in Singapore. So if you go to Thailand or Cambodia, BYD is building a factory in Cambodia. So what you're starting to see in the last couple months since Liberation Day is that the rest of the world says, wait a minute, Trump is attacking all of us. We now need to move closer to China's economic orbit. If Trump had just focused on working with allies, Canada, Europe, Japan, South Korea, then he might have been able to create a pincer and really contain China. But he went after everyone. So when you go after Canada, our closest ally in the United States, when you go after Japan's auto sector and steel sector, you now have a close ally and an American vassal essentially saying, we can no longer trust the United States. Let's go to China. And that's why I'm more bullish on the economy now in China than any point in the last 6 years. One final point on that. I was recently in Brussels keynoting a conference.
Mhm.
And, Brussels, where you have Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU, she's been one of the biggest China hawks for years, pushing the decoupling or de-risking trend from Europe from China. When I was in Brussels, she even said, we can no longer rely on the United States. We now need to pivot back towards China. And that's why in the last week, Europe and China both have gotten all of the sanctions off of members of parliament, government officials, and think tanks, which is a great first step towards rebuilding the relationships. China's economy is on very stable footing because of what Trump has done. It's, in China, they joke and they call him Trump. His nickname is sort of the builder of countries. He is the gift that keeps on giving to Xi Jinping and the CPC economically.
But how reliant are these two economies on each other? In other words, China and the U.S. Used to be major trading partners. In many ways, they still are. Is a permanent decoupling now the future? In other words, do they still need each other?
China needs America to some extent. It's clear that China benefits from trade with the United States. That's 100% clear. It's also clear that the United States benefits from trade with China. And because of how manufacturing supply chains are set up, the United States 100% needs China. Otherwise, we don't get rare earths. We don't get antibiotics. We don't even get ibuprofen. We don't get, iPhones. So the countries both work better by cooperating together. Let me be very clear on that. The peoples of America, the peoples of China work well together. Now, what's important is a lot of people in DC right now say that China stole jobs from the United States. That's not true, right? China created an ecosystem. They have the infrastructure, good tax breaks, a well-trained labor force to be able to attract investment from the companies like Nike, like Apple. They were able to outcompete the United States. So you can't blame China for stealing jobs. If you're going to blame anyone, it should be the oligarchs in the United States. It should be Phil Knight from Nike, or Steve Jobs from Apple, who wanted to benefit from cheap labor in China. You can blame them, or you can blame political toadies like Hillary Clinton, who was on the board of Walmart and helped push that trend towards outsourcing. But frankly, David, I don't blame Phil Knight. I don't blame Steve Jobs. I don't even blame Hillary Clinton, because shifting these supply chain to China benefited America. American consumers are able to buy more than what they were able to buy before. American companies had greater profits and profit margins, so were able to employ and pay their employees better. And stock investors were able to benefit from the last 25 years of China getting into the WTO with fatter margins and higher stock prices. It's clear both countries work well together, and we need to combat the national security threat, the fear mongering, the scaremongering, almost a McCarthy 2.0 situation, and say, look, Scotty Besson's right. We should have more production of some products in China back into the United States. But at the end of the day, trade between the both countries help each other. Let's be clear. China's still a poor nation. Average GDP per capita is only 12,000 US. China benefits from selling to the United States.
What happens now? So there's a pause in the tariffs for 90 days. What would, so two scenarios. One, after 90 days, the tariff renew and we have reintroduction of new tariffs. We don't know how much that would be. Or number two, they are on permanent pause. In other words, it's not going to happen. So what would lead, what roads would lead to either outcome?
So I think in scenario one, if Trump were to slap the tariffs back on again, that would just cause more pain once again to the American consumer and American companies, which would be a real problem politically for Trump in the
run-up.
Just
you don't see China slapping on tariffs first? That's not a possibility?
No, I don't see China provoking that because they don't want to have tariffs. They understand economic reason. Free trade benefits both countries. So Trump, if he slapped it back on, he would have a political problem in the run-up to Christmas, in the run-up to the midterm elections in Congress next year. So he might do it. But I think what they're really more scenario two is try to come up with some of a detente, a deal, where the Chinese try to agree to buy more soybeans, to buy more American products. Scotty Besson, I think in an interview with CNBC or some other outlet today said, basically we had a good trade deal after the first administration, but the Chinese reneged on it during Biden because they knew that Biden was weak. I don't think that's why they reneged on it. I think they reneged on it because the economy was so bad and COVID hit. So they weren't able to afford all of the deals. But I think what you're going to see is the Chinese are going to go and say, look, we're going to buy more aerospace equipment, airplanes from Boeing. We're going to buy more soybeans. If you'll sell it to us, we're going to buy more semiconductor chips from NVIDIA or Qualcomm or Intel. I think that there's a real opportunity for a good trade deal to happen in the next 90 days, or enough progress to be made that Trump says, let's add another 90 days, just like he's done with TikTok, right? We're getting close to the time when TikTok should be banned, but Trump has already said maybe he'll extend it another 90 days because conversations are going well. I think that is the more likely scenario for the trade war. And this is why the Chinese like Trump, because he's not as much of an ideologue, right? It's the type of thing where he'll take a $400 million jet from Qatar and somehow, spin that to MAGA as not corrupt, as something that helps America because he's saving $400 million from the defense budget on getting a free airplane. Now, that to me is complete corruption, but I think that he's willing to make a deal. And so if the Chinese say, we want to buy more NVIDIA chips or we want to buy more Intel chips, this gives him the political cover to say to MAGA and his cult-like followers that he was able to get 200 billion, 300 billion more dollars in sales for American companies. And Jensen Huang, the founder of NVIDIA, was in Beijing a couple weeks ago saying, we still want to sell to China because it's a $50 billion AI race. We think we're going to lose 5.5 billion if we're not allowed to sell our chips there. He's putting political pressure on Trump. You see AMD, Lisa Su has said that they're going to lose $1.5–2 billion if they can't sell to China. So you're starting to see the tycoons, the oligarchs in America are starting to pressure Trump to say, look, we need to keep selling. So I think scenario two is a far more likely situation, like a revolving scenario two, 90 days, maybe to 180 days. And China would want it because, frankly, they want chips from the United States.
Right. So this is from Friday. China's central bank said on Friday they will spur financial institutions to expand support for consumption and foreign trade amid a protracted trade war. Beijing stepped up efforts this week to cushion the economic damage caused by the tariff conflict with Washington, announcing a raft of stimulus measures, including interest rate cuts and a major injection of liquidity. Well, I guess that happened before this news today that the tariffs were going to be on pause. Do you think the central bank is going to reverse course?
No, I think they're going to continue to do targeted stimulus. It's not going to be a bazooka-like stimulus. It's not going to be a major fiscal stimulus. China has still run out of money, right? During the COVID era, business wasn't done. I'm in my closet right now where I was locked down for 3 months during the Shanghai lockdown of 2022. My company didn't make any revenue. We didn't make any profits. We didn't pay local governments any tax money. So China has run out of money at the local government level. So they're not going to launch a major stimulus anytime soon, like Wall Street hopes. What they are going to do is targeted stimulus. So they're dropping the reserve ratio requirements by 50 basis points last week. They're going to make it easier for people to try to buy homes. The real estate sector is still weak. Shanghai is stabilized, but second and third tier cities are still dropping their prices. To me, the real estate sector and an aging population, nobody's getting married, nobody's having babies, and local government debt. Those three things are far more serious than even the 145% tariffs from the United States on China. That we can take care of, which Trump has done, at least for the next 90 days. These other three issues are much harder to work through. It's going to take a while. But so what the government's going to do is more targeted stimulus. What do? They'll give money back if you buy a phone. So I just bought my son a Xiaomi phone because he got a 500 RMB subsidy. Mm-hmm. And the phone itself was already half the price of Apple, which is why the iPhones The rumor is that they dropped the price today 150 to 180 US dollars so far because Apple iPhone is just far too expensive compared to Xiaomi and Huawei and Oppo and Vivo. You see car companies like BYD and Xiaomi are soaring because they're getting subsidies and all types of benefits. So the sales of NEV soared last month year on year. I forget the exact number, but it was a much higher number than any point in the last couple of years because of these subsidies. So it's going to be targeted stimulus, not a bazooka-like situation. The government understands that anxiety, weak economy is still there, but because of Trump's tariffs, because of DeepSeek, because of Ne 2, there's a feeling within China that China can overcome America's crippling sanctions and can start to get its economic mojo back. And that's why you're starting to see, I think, in the next 6 months, the Chinese consumer is going to go out and spend more. Investors should be looking in the tourist sector at companies like Ctrip, which is a place where you buy plane tickets, book hotels. That's a great one. I think, some of the sports apparel brands like a Hoka is another one, and On are companies that you should be looking at, as well as Luckin and Chagi on tea and coffee beverages.
Okay. Finally, let's talk about the India-Pakistan conflict that is escalating as we speak. Now, the U.S. administration previously said it was "quote unquote" none of our business, but it seems like now things are changing. J.D. Vance, vice president, apparently had a call with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi to encourage ceasefire talks over this escalating conflict. There has been a lot of escalation over the weekend. What is the U.S.'s role in this conflict? Per what they said earlier, it was none of their business, but I guess no longer.
I think I'll answer it this way. A lot of people in India have been saying that China launched a proxy war on India via Pakistan and via the terrorists. Now, I don't know, who caused the deaths to those innocent people, which is shameful behavior. I don't know if it was Pakistani terrorists acting on their own or if it was Pakistan's government, working in cahoots with these terrorists. But to me, it's very clear that this was not something that China wanted. So I don't understand the Hindu nationalists who are putting the blame for these deaths on China. It's very clear that China over the last several months have been moving closer to India, which is a real benefit for China because they wanted to have a balance of power away from American hegemony. I think this was a good deal by Modi. Modi is close to Russia. I think it's good if he gets a little bit closer to China, trying to balance deals with the United States. But what I usually recommend to my Indian friends is, look, if you think about it, you want to get close to the United States because you can get economic growth from them, but you can't become a vassal. You can't get too close because at some point, India is going to become a major superpower. It's going to take 10, 20 years, but India is going to become a superpower and take their rightful place in world affairs as the world's most populous nation, getting more say in international affairs. This is something that I want to see happen to India, but India needs to be careful. If they get too close to the United States is going to try to contain or destroy them. We've seen this. The US government doesn't like to have any type of competition. In the 1980s, when Japan grew, the United States with the Plaza Accord with Reagan, where they forced the Japanese to appreciate the yen, dismantle Toshiba's semiconductor sector, they really caused Japan to stagnate for the last 40 years, which is something I wrote about in my new book, The Split, which talks about the Plaza Accords. The United States has tried doing it with China by containing Huawei, the semiconductor. I don't think it's clearly not working well with China because China is too strong from a manufacturing standpoint and has too much innovation. China's just too powerful. But the thing, David, is that as India gets stronger, it's clear that the United States is going to try to contain India's growth. And that would be bad for India, obviously. So what India needs to do is play the United States and China off each other. Be close to China, but also be close to the United States. Right now, India has banned about 70 or 80 major apps from China into India, like TikTok is banned now. Xiaomi always has tax investigations. I think it would be smart for the Hindu nationalists to realize China had nothing to gain from this terrorist attack.
Okay.
China had everything to lose from the terrorist attack. It would be great if the peoples of India and China worked together. How great would it be if 2.5 billion people, 2.7 billion people were living in countries that have close free trade? That would benefit these relatively poor nations on a per capita basis and help the countries become global economic superpowers. China had everything to lose from this terrorist attack.
You don't see this playing out in such a way that it would dramatically change geopolitical dynamics between China and the US?
I do see there's a risk of that. I definitely see a risk because India, it's interesting. I'm very active on LinkedIn and Twitter. The most hate I get is from Twitter India. I get a lot of the Hindu nationalists who just hate anything to do with China. Now, I don't know India very well. I'm not an expert, so I don't know if they're representative of sentiment throughout all of India. But I think that there's enough hatred in India towards China that might box in Modi or other future governments from really coming up with a strong relationship with China, because it's possible that the domestic politics, and because India is a democracy and needs to get votes, that the Indian population won't vote in somebody who wants to be too close to China. There's definitely that risk there for the two countries from getting a good relationship.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for your update. Very timely and important update. Where can we follow you and read more from your work in the meantime?
I'm very active on Twitter, but the best thing to find me, David, is my book, The Split, that just came out a couple months ago. It looks at the geopolitical tension between the US and China and what that means for other nations. Not to just self-sell, but this is the most timely book in the world for anyone who's interested in investing and geopolitical trends. That's the best way to reach me.
All right, we'll put the links down below, so make sure to follow Shaun there. Thank you very much, Shaun. We'll speak again next time. Take care for now.